Hi, welcome to Hegel on the Beach again. I think this is number 14. Last week we did Master Slave. We're still doing a bit of it, but we're going to move on to freedom of self-consciousness, Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. And the last part of Master Slave, we've got this paragraph which is 197, which is, without the discipline of service and obedience, fear is mired in formality and does not diffuse itself over the conscious actuality of existence. Having a mind of his own is then only stubbornness, a freedom that remains bogged down within the bounds of servility. So that's the mentality of the slave. So freedom, therefore, isn't this libertarian fantasy of freedom from. Freedom begins in slavery. Slavery is fear and obedience. So we had this battle, remember, last time. The slave lost and the institution of slavery was born. Slave, peel me a grape. Slave, polish my shoes. And by the way, I do have a master slave joke. So I'll tell it. It's Thunderbirds, which was a British puppet show from the 1960s, 70s. So you've got Lady Penelope, who's the master or mistress, and you've got Parker, who's the chauffeur. Okay, so I'm going to do it, okay, because it's just too good an opportunity to miss. Ready? Lady Penelope. Parker? Yes, my lady. Remove my coat. Yes, my lady. Parker? Yes, my lady. Remove my shoes. Yes, my lady. Parker? Yes, my lady. Remove my dress. Yes, my lady. Parker? Yes, my lady. Remove my underwear. Yes, my lady. And Parker? Yes, my lady. Don't let me ever catch you wearing them again. Okay, there's my Thunderbirds joke, my master slave joke. I just got to, you've got to tell her, haven't you? You have to do it. So, Lady Penelope, who is the master, she can order the slave to do anything she wants. The slave's frightened on the pain of death to disobey the master. His or her bodily movements are controlled to the last detail by the master. But there is one thing that the master cannot control: your mind. Hegel says, within thinking, I am free because I'm not in another, but rather I remain utterly at one with myself and the object, which to me is the essence, is in undivided unity, my being for myself. And my moving about in concepts is a movement within myself. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? So Hegel goes on in paragraph 198 to describe this new form of self-consciousness, because this truly is the start of self-consciousness as we know it. It's the beginning of interiority. Remember Descartes and I think therefore I am. Yeah, well, cogito ergo sum. Well, that's it. This is the Stoic moment, the foundational part of the story. So this is Hegel. As it consciously appeared in the history of spirit, this freedom of self-consciousness, this interiority, yeah, is as well known being called Stoicism. Its principle is this: consciousness is the thinking essence, and something only has essentiality for consciousness or is true and good for it insofar as consciousness conducts itself therein as a thinking being. So Hegel reminds us this is a history of spirit, or a history of human consciousness. This consciousness is thereby negative with regard to the relationship of mastery and servitude. So it's negative because you can't do anything with it. It's just in there. Its doing consists in neither being the master who has the truth in the servant, nor in being the servant who has the truth in the will of the master and in serving him. Rather, it consists in being free within all the dependencies of a singular existence, whether on the throne or in fetters, and maintaining blah, blah, blah. So where does this on the throne come from? Well, we're going to come to that, because this concept is very attractive even to masters. And on the throne, he's referring to Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Right? So Stoicism is an appealing doctrine. So Stoicism makes its entrance in the next act of Hegel's play. It tries to make sense of the slave existence, But as the quote points out, the power of Stoicism means also that it becomes, or it can become, part of the philosophy of the master. So as I said, Marcus Aurelius, Richard Harris from Gladiator, yeah, in the film Gladiator. So once the master-slave conflict is resolved with the victory of the master, the resolution is a contradictory peace, because the slave's not happy, is he? I, the slave, cannot be bodily free. I cannot be free without, but I can be free within. I can be free in my head. I can daydream about what I want. I can fantasize that I am a master. I can fantasize anything. You can even theorize. And the master can't do anything about that. So this is an utterly private and utterly individual realm. And we can now see how that idea might actually be quite appealing to masters. In the ancient world, so I want to just a bit of a historical digression. The ancient world, slavery became really supercharged and industrial with the arrival of the Romans. There were enormous constraints on slave resistance that developed, but we need to, and of course, we need to appreciate the rarity of slave resistance anywhere, not just in the Roman Empire. But the Roman conquest resulted in like an unprecedented influx of wealth, concentrated in the hands of a small number of Romans who used it to buy luxury goods. They had large amounts of land to work the new land. The landowners needed slaves. And this isn't really an economic history, so I apologize. I'm skipping a bit, really. It's just the background. But Rome was the backdrop to the development of an agricultural economy that created the most intensive development of agrarian slavery anywhere. And most of the slaves were manual agricultural laborers. And they were like a permanent workforce. It was really a revolutionary new rural economy of plantation owners and plantation agriculture. And Roman writers invented the term latifundia, which meant wide fields to describe this type of economic system. And the site of its most intense development was the island of Sicily. So it wasn't really the Spartacus thing, which came a bit later, but Sicily. And in the first half of the century, after around 2000 BC, it became the site of two dramatic slave rebellions that were the exceptions to this rule about, slave obedience. And the first one was called the First Servile War. And the slaves in the east and the west of Sicily, they appear to have revolted separately. Those in the east under the slave named Eunice, and those in the west under somebody called Cleon. Eunice was a magician and he was a religious leader. And Cleon, he was a manager of a farming operation in western Sicily. But like Eunice, he was also supposed to have had religious power and so on. But Eunice proclaimed himself a king. In fact, he called himself King Antiochus because some people said he came from Syria. The slaves were beaten, and Eunice, or King Antiochus, they died in prison from disease. But nevertheless, this idea of a slave becoming a king, it continued into the Second War. So Diodorus Siculus, who's a Roman writer. Now, when we talk about the Roman writers, I'll come to it. They're not going to tell the truth because they're slave owners and they're based on a slave society. So these Roman writers, you can't trust them entirely, but some of it rings a bit true. So I'll go on to this. So he wrote about the Second Servile War. This was the second slave war on the island of Sicily. And of course, there's no slave narratives that survive, is there? Because they were all killed or they remained in slavery. And there's none published. So we've got to read between the lines. So this is what Diodorus says. He says, not only did the mass of slaves, this is in the Second World War, who moved to open rebellion overrun the country, but even free persons who lived in the countryside and had no possessions of their own turned to robbery and lawless behaviour. Both because of their poverty and because of their general conditions of lawlessness, the poor citizens of the cities burst out into the countryside, organising criminal gangs. They drove off herds of cattle, carried off the crops that had been stored in granaries, and murdered anyone who they happened to meet, whether free or slave, so that no one would survive to bring back a report of their madness and criminality. There was general anarchy, both because there was no Roman rule to dispense justice to anyone, and because many people simply usurped power for which they were not answerable to anyone. The suffering that they caused was immense. For this reason, every place suffered from pillage. The poor had simply usurped the power to dispossess the rich of their property. So the emperor sent 600 soldiers to take care of the rebels. They were beaten. The slave gained confidence. They stole a big supply of weapons. they formed leadership under a slave called Salvius. Now remember, Eunice proclaimed himself the king as King Antiochus of the royal Seleucid line, which was the Greek line who ruled Syria. Salvius, he also followed suit, and he assumed the royal name of Tryphon. I hope I'm pronouncing Diodotus Tryphon, a Seleucid king. So what happened now is interesting, because we can see that the slaves were only kind of recently captured slaves, and Roman slavery, it was newly formed, this massive incorporation of slaves. And these slaves, many of them, most of them, remembered their homeland in the Eastern Mediterranean, and their response was slavery was to do what? Okay, so I'll skip a bit, because essentially they didn't want to be stoical about it. They weren't going to go, oh God, I'm a slave. I'm free in my head though, and I'll have these fantasies. No. These slaves, Stoicism hadn't taken root, and they wanted to be free, in the sense of, I want to get rid of this slave master, and I want to be the master instead of the master. So Diodorus writes, this King Tryphon, he made sacrifices to the Palycian heroes and made them an offering of one sea-dyed purple cloak. Purple was the royal colour, in gratitude for his victory over the Romans. He then announced that he was King Tryphon, and he was hailed as a king by the rebel slaves. So they weren't abolishing slavery, they were announcing a new person sitting on the throne. And he was hailed as a king by the rebel slaves, intending to seize Triacula and to construct a palace for himself at that place. He then sent a dispatch to Athenion, I think he was one of his generals, summoning the man like a king would summon one of his generals. So it's started all over again, isn't it? The slaves rebel, and they're going to do what the Romans did. So the slaves, again, they don't have this interior monologue or this alternative model of sociality that Stoicism presents, which is, let's be honest with you, it's shit, isn't it, being a slave? So it's not, oh, it's really good that. I mean, who blames them? So we're not blaming them, but explaining. So what did they do? They just appointed another king, complete with a palace, royal trappings, no attempt to come to terms with their liberation from slavery, other than by having another king, another master, and the slave Tryphon set himself up as a master, a king. There's no internal working through of slavery. Slavery hasn't been internalized at all. It's been rejected. The writer continues, whenever King Tryphon conducted official business, he donned a purple toga and a wide-bordered Greek cloak. He also had lictors holding symbolic axes, the famous, like, I think you see it in fascist, obviously this wasn't a fascist thing, but, how you hold the Roman axes, yeah? They held symbolic axes to precede him, as well as all other accoutrements that are suitable to the embellishment of royal power. So what's he going to do? This is it's not an alternative to slavery. It's just a new form, and the slaves have won. But unfortunately, after the slave revolt failed, Tryphon was killed. Most of the slaves were recaptured. But the end for the slaves illustrates something else. I think this is just my particular view. I could be wrong, but it's interesting. So I was reading some of the Roman sources about slavery. There's a very interesting book. I can't remember it, but it describes what it was not what it was like to be a slave. There's no one there, but the master's accounts of slavery and the master's ideologist's account of slavery. So some people say that when they were beaten, right, these slaves brought their lives to a most glorious end when they refused to do battle with the wild animals. They were told to fight wild animals in the arena, and instead they cut each other down in front of the public altars. Satyros killed himself. He was the last man. He took his life with his own hand, dying like a hero. So the model isn't one of acceptance and stoicism. The model of the First and Second Servile Wars is, do you know what? I'm not going to, in the battle, they're not going to give up in the battle. The master doesn't give up, neither does the slave, because the slave thinks like a master. He thinks, no, I will die rather than become a slave. So that refusal to submit is not stoicism. So this is how stoicism arrives, because we've got this enormous and essential, this slavery institution that is embedded for centuries. So, as I said, these slaves become masters. They'd rather accept death than be enslaved. No longer could they return to slavery. And as I said, that's the historical backdrop for Stoicism. Now, Stoicism, what does it mean? So, the word, it refers to a bit boring bit now. It was all exciting about people killing each other and, exciting battles. So, Stoicism refers to a philosophical school founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BC. And the school met in what was called the Painted Stoa, which was a covered colonnade. Imagine these columns going down in the Agora in Athens, in the marketplace where everyone was yapping away and talking. And this is how the Stoics got their name, from the Stoa. And many early Stoic works haven't survived, there's a little bit of humour around that. I'll come to it. And the Roman literary genius Seneca, he's the first Stoic for whom we've got really considerable literary evidence because his works have survived. Another Stoic is Musonius Rufus. He was not a slave, he was of high social rank like Seneca. So you can see how the Stoic thing got into the mind of the masters. They didn't accept slavery, but they were trying to come to terms with it. Okay, so when he was in Rome, Musonius Rufus, he taught philosophy, and it seems that this very important person, Epictetus, he attended his lectures. And Epictetus is important because he was born around 50 AD in Asia Minor, and he began his life as a slave. And he was owned by a high-ranking Roman called, I hope I get this right, Epaphroditus. And he was the secretary to the Roman emperors, Nero, while the Rome burns and, crazy stuff, and also Domitian. Epictetus, he experienced, as a slave, the inner workings of the Roman imperial society. And he apparently attended, because, some of the slaves, the ones, if you're working down if you're working in a silver mine in Athens, it's awful. If you're working on agricultural slavery, it's awful. But if you're your secretary, because you're literate, if you're a literate slave, you've got a certain amount of, let's be honest, freedom. You can see it in the film, the Kirk Douglas film, Tony Curtis. He's a singer, isn't he? He's a poet. So not all slaves. So some slaves had an opportunity to do free stuff and maybe had reasonable masters. So when he was a slave in Rome, Epictetus was permitted to attend lectures of Musonius Rufus, and he was granted his freedom later on. Now, just two interesting things about philosophy. I said the philosophers, if you go to a philosophy lecture today, probably it's a bit boring or whatever. It might be interesting but it's, you've got to go through a course and stuff like that, because if philosophy means anything, it's got to be exciting. It's got to mean something to people's real lives. Now, even though you think Stoicism couldn't possibly impact anyone, the Emperor Vespasian, he banned all philosophers from Rome in the year 71. And Domitian, he banished from Italy in the year 95. So there's something about philosophy that if you get it right, it does make the powerful feel troubled, okay? Anyway, the key to happiness for Epictetus, he's the slave who becomes the free man. And by the way, someone said that Epictetus, this is a by the by, he had a lamp, and because he was like a celebrity, someone paid something like 3,000 sesterces for his lamp because he was so cool. Anyway, for Epictetus, the key to happiness is to continually analyze our experience of the world in terms of this opposition. Okay, this is the opposition. What is up to us and what is not up to us. And if I want to play football for Liverpool, right, which might not be difficult given their last performance, where they got beat 4-1 in Naples by in the Champions League. Okay, this will probably be very dated. So if I want to play for Liverpool, okay, that's not up to me. I'm never going to play for Liverpool. So I just deal on the things that are, that's not that I can work with, right? My crap footballing skills. Okay, so human misery, says Epictetus, is the product of people not understanding the significance of this opposition. What's up to me and what's not up to me. And they assume that they've got control of things when they don't. And instead, we should base our happiness on those things that are up to us, on those things that can never be taken away from us. So it's a bit like, you see mental health first aid training. So it's like, or mindfulness. What's up to you? Stuff like that. So it's a form of Stoicism, these kind of modern versions that you might see. Okay, now back to, the famous Roman emperor we've seen in Gladiator, Richard Harris, Marcus Aurelius. He was a big admirer of Epictetus. So we've got the most powerful man in Rome, Marcus Aurelius, and you've got Epictetus, who's a slave. And he loves him. He thinks he's great. And he says, it's a great quote, by the way. He's a big admirer of Epictetus. And he writes this. It is a beautiful quote. A bit miserable from Marcus Aurelius, but he says, very miserable, but you can see why he's stoical. In human life, our time is a point, our substance flowing, our perception faint, the constitution of our whole body decaying, our soul a spinning wheel, our fortune hard to predict, and our fame doubtful. That is to say, all the things of the body are a river, things of the soul a dream and delusion, life is a war and a journey in a foreign land, and afterwards, oblivion. Yeah, so by the way, he wrote this for himself. Maybe it was a barrel of laughs when he was in company, but you can see that's the stoical Marcus Aurelius view. Now, moving on, Sextus Empiricus. Now, remember Sextus Empiricus? He was the skeptical fella, because skepticism and stoicism are related. And I'm going to run out of time, so I won't get on probably to skepticism, but there's a little, maybe next time. So Sextus Empiricus was the fella who doubted everything. He doubts his own mind, remember? So he's better, the skeptic, the ancient skeptic, than the modern skeptic. You remember that bit? So skeptic, Sextus Empiricus, he was around the year 200, and he was a Hellenistic philosopher. He was a follower of Pyrrho. And where we get this word Pyrrhonian skepticism from. And he might have been a doctor like Galen. Galen's a famous Roman doctor who was the first person to spot the Antonine Plague. And you had to be a Stoic then because, a quarter of the population died. So you can see, the power that Stoicism assumed in these terrible times. But anyway, so this form of skepticism and rejection of the world and so on like that, that is common to, this is becoming really powerful at this time. So Epictetus, let's see what he finds. He believes that the real Stoic is a person who can match actions with words. Yeah, pretty straightforward that. So the task of philosophy is to understand nature so you can live in accordance with nature and so achieve happiness, or this Greek word, eudaimonia. It chilled out. Doesn't mean you're like, you're laughing. It means you're like, oh man, that's not cool here. Look at the sky. Look at the beautiful beach. Yeah, that's eudaimonia. Okay, if you're like that all the time, if you can look out at that beach all the time and say, look at that, that is just, okay, yeah. If only we keep that old, but we can't be, can we? So the study of philosophical theories is always subordinate to this goal of achieving eudaimonia. So Epictetus sees philosophy as an art, techne in Greek, that, like other arts and crafts, it's oriented towards a practical outcome. So for Stoicism, mastery of subtle and complex philosophical arguments is not the goal. Okay, so it isn't to understand Hegel if you're a Stoic. Okay, so I think so. I'm not too sure who says this. I've just put a quote in. He says, if you could analyze syllogisms like Chrysippus, what is to prevent you from being wretched, sorrowful, envious, and in a word, being distracted and miserable? Not a single thing. So for Epictetus then, a student of philosophy shouldn't just waste his time on the analysis of texts. He shouldn't waste his time on that. He should concentrate his attention on transforming his soul to conform with Stoic philosophical principles. Of course, you've got to study the text. It doesn't mean you can't do without them, but it's just a means to an end. So Stoic students who understood Epictetus' philosophy, in theory, would focus their attention on transforming their way of life in an attempt to approach the life of a Stoic sage, like Epictetus. So they wanted to be like him. They weren't so much interested in the text. Yeah, they'd talk about it, but it was about, how can I be like Epictetus? How can I be like Diogenes the Cynic? Diogenes is the famous guy who on a day like today, Alexander the Great walks into town. He stands over him and says to Diogenes, he says, famous story, he says, are you Diogenes? Tell me something cool. And he goes, you're blocking my sun. Clear off. So that's Diogenes the Cynic. Be like him. Who cares? I'm more interested in what's in my head. Above all, Socrates. Socrates was the big cheese for the Stoics. So even though, look, Socrates was arguing all the time about philosophy, but it wasn't, the Stoics were not interested in philosophical argument as such. And unlike the Platonists and, and the Aristotelians of the same period, one of the reasons why Stoicism declined and one of the reasons why their early texts might have been lost is because they weren't that bothered about the text. They were more interested in transforming the soul. Like, like self-help books. It was a self-help book. You throw it away because you've reached your goal. So, another quote. Philosophy does not promise to secure anything for humans, eternal for humans, external for humans. Otherwise, it would be admitting something that lies beyond its proper subject matter. For just as wood is the material of the carpenter, bronze of the statuary, so each individual's own life is the material of the art of living. Okay? Self-help. So for Seneca, like Epictetus, actions speak louder than words. And in one of the letters he writes, this is Seneca, writes this, philosophy is no trick to catch the public. It's not devised for show. It's a matter not of words, but of facts. It's not pursued in order that the day may yield some amusement for it's spent. So it's not about reading books. It molds and constructs the soul. It orders our life, guides our conduct, and shows us what we should do and what we should leave undone. Without it, no one can live fearlessly or with peace of mind. Now that explains maybe why Seneca had a very performative death. He wanted to show the world how I'm opening my veins, and he doesn't commit suicide. So then he tries another means to commit suicide, and it's very dramatic, and everyone in the household sees him commit suicide. Yeah. So suicide, I keep on coming back to suicide in these things, but it's not me. I'm just reading the stuff, okay? I'm just telling you what people are saying. Okay, Hegel writes this. As a universal form of world spirit, Stoicism, can only come on the scene during a time of universal fear and servitude, but which is also a time of universal cultural formation that has raised culturally formative activity all the way up to the heights of thinking. So what that means is that Stoicism really comes into its own when all the slaves realize there's no way out, that the Romans are always going to win, when Spartacus is being killed, when the slave revolts are being put down across the Roman Empire, and you just got to put up with it. So you have to be a Stoic because there's no escape. Okay, so why does Stoicism go nowhere? So it's a dead end. Remember that many of its texts are lost. It's still with us. I mean, it's everywhere, as I said, in self-help texts and God knows what else. And, it's can't help. It's part of who we are. But Hegel writes this: the general terms true and the good, wisdom and virtue with which Stoicism is stuck are on the whole undeniably uplifting. But because they cannot in fact end up in any expansion of content, they quickly start to become tiresome, which means Stoicism reaches a dead end. Now we're going to come next week, bit of Stoicism, bit more skepticism, but then the unhappy consciousness is going to try to resolve these difficulties. So from sunny Llandudno, let's have a bit of eudaimonia, a bit of Greek happiness. Look at that. And I'll turn the camera around on this occasion so you can see this other lovely view. Look at that. Eudaimonia, happiness. Cool. And the windmills. What a view. Okay, so bye for now.